So, Chris Stark, you're the Chief Executive of the Committee for Climate Change, and it's an important day for the committee because it's released its annual report. And it is a special year because we've seen a tremendous increase in the public's awareness of climate change, and just very recently, the UK government's commitment now, legal commitment, to get the country to net zero by 2050. So, in that context, how well is the UK government doing?
When we look back at the 25 things that we said the government needed to do over the next 12 months last June, we find they've only done one of them.
Yeah, so there seems to be quite a large disconnect perhaps between what the government is saying it's going to do, what it's going to be legally obliged to do, and what it's actually doing. So where's that disconnect coming from, and do you think they're going to be able to narrow that gap?
So I think there's an interesting thing that's been happening in government. I mean, I encounter people in government, great officials, and I should say a few good ministers as well, who really do get this and they do understand it. And it's almost like you have two governments, a kind of government that's on the one hand willing to make this enormously bold step and enshrine in law net zero, cutting emissions by 100%. And on the other hand, hasn't yet confronted all the steps that need to be taken to get to net zero, never mind the 80% target that we had just a few weeks ago. And I think there's a really interesting question lurking behind all this, which is how honestly or seriously has the government really taken this? Mm-hmm. And how clear is it that it is every single bit of government's job to get us there? I hope, and it is only a hope at this moment, that we turn that real enthusiasm to do something about climate change that led to the net zero target into now a series of credible plans for meeting it. And we know all the things that need to be done to do that.
So the focus at the moment is on net zero, but that doesn't mean we won't be emitting any carbon at all by the middle of this century. So what does net zero actually mean?
So it's net zero because for some sectors they can go all the way to zero, and for others they will find it very difficult, and we therefore need something that's on the negative side, what we call emissions removal. And that is very simply either natural removals, most obviously growing trees to store away carbon, or increasingly we are of the view that an essential component of the strategy overall is that you need this thing called carbon capture and storage. And the UK is one of the best places in the world to do that because we have the North Sea just off our east coast. And that's where you can capture the carbon from a series of processes, again, something we know very much about. We can actually pipe it back down into the North Sea where it's put back into the geology of the ground effectively, safely. And that it may sound fantastical now, but it's a really sensible and indeed cheap strategy overall if we're to get to zero emissions globally.
So some people are arguing that the 2050 deadline or target for net zero isn't ambitious enough. You're always going to be between a rock and a hard place. People want to stall, other people want you to have much more ambition. And the reports that the CCC produce are filled with language to the effect of what's going to be credible or feasible. So who determines or who shapes what is credible or feasible in our current political climate?
I suppose the easiest way to think about the challenge overall is that 2050 is an enormous, ambitious step forward. It is not going to be easy to get there. And there's some really big numbers you can play around with just to understand that. So, you're going to be talking over the next 30 years, there's about 30 million buildings in this country. Every one of those buildings needs to be fully decarbonised. We've got 40 million or thereabouts vehicles on our roads. They all need to be removed, except perhaps a handful at the end. If you want to drive a classic car, we've allowed for that. There are all sorts of really important barriers to doing it sooner. But let me say, I would love to be in the position that the government has put such ambitious policies in place early that we can go back and say, well, actually, on that trajectory, we could do it sooner. But I think we'd only be talking about maybe a handful of years in that circumstance. And we do not have the policies in place at the moment, which is one of the messages from our progress report this year, that the government hasn't yet demonstrated that kind of ambition and the kind of front-loaded strategy to reduce emissions that you would need to see an earlier date. Well, there's only really a window for that over the next 12 to 18 months. Mm-hmm. So I would love to see the government respond to that and to allow us to take a more ambitious still view of the target. But at the moment, 2050 is right on the edge of what we would regard as feasible and pragmatic. And it is not an unambitious target by any stretch.